Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Wednesday night Bible class here at Gipps Street Church of Christ. I'm really glad that, again, people could join in and participate in a Bible study from your own homes or with small groups. Again, a very great thanks to AJ for being here and for being tech support and making all this happen. I'm quite sure I've got a much easier bit and a much less stressful bit. So it's a real great credit to him, and not only for contributing to the church in this way, but just for the knowledge and the skills that he has in these areas. Last week, we were just taking a short break from Daniel Smith's series of lessons, and we're just doing a two-part lesson on anger and outrage. And last week we looked at basically anger as a problem, outrage as a problem. And I promised this week we'd try and be a bit lighter and actually focus on something that we can do about it. But just to briefly recap, we noted that outrage is a part of our culture, a part of the very day-to-day media that comes across us, partly in broadcast media, partly in the voices and actions of public figures, people who are given a voice on airwaves, in print and screen media, and very often they're either people who are using anger and outrage simply to stir the pot, simply to drive numbers to an audience, and that audience they can then sell to advertisers. Sometimes they genuinely mean their anger and their outrage, but very often it is anger and outrage that is directed towards more vulnerable people, less powerful people, people undeserving of such outrage, outrage that is very often shorn of context, skewed in certain ways, simplistic, designed to tickle ears, designed to stir people up with no real productive purpose. We noted, using the example of Novak Djokovic, who you should be seeing on the screen now, and that what has become quite a famous recent incident of outrage having consequences, of anger that leads to actions that are detrimental, that leads to a lack of self-control, that leads to what can really be determined as selfish indulgence. He was angry simply at losing a game, and the consequences of his anger was an injury to a neutral umpire who was simply there trying to serve his tennis game, to serve the entertainment that he was providing through television to the audience, and that she would get paid a lot less than him, and certainly not in the position that he was. And that we see this again and again, the ways in which anger manifests itself into detrimental behaviours and harmful outcomes. I believe in the past week, even though Novak Djokovic played and indeed won the Italian Open, that he had still more problems with outbursts of anger, and that his sort of defense was, well, this is who I am. I'm an intense person, I'm focused on winning, I need to channel these emotions in order to play at my best. But yet, to what ends? What does it do for the people around about him? And so we kind of said, very simplistically perhaps, but don't be like Djokovic. Don't be self-centered. Don't be letting our anger control us and flowing through to actions that are harmful and embarrassing and detrimental. We noted, as we rounded the last class last week, that there are alternatives, that indeed another tennis player, a female tennis player, that of Naomi Osaka, that she, in her own game, has had to face both the uncontrolled rage of opponents and the unsettling nature that can have, and also her own challenges with anger and the rising emotions of playing elite sport and losing, going from a winning position to neutral and worse, and the rapid changes in emotion that can lead, and how she, despite being quite young, has largely been able to, in a very glaring spotlight, control her emotions and to succeed as a result. But we also noted that even more importantly, when she has got angry, she's got angry about things that are of importance, things of moral justice, things of corruption, things of abuses of power. And she, in her own way, with whatever platform that she has, people watching her, true for her tennis, but she has drawn attention to circumstances that we should all be angry about, that we should all be upset about, that we should all want change to happen, that we should all not let simply slide. And we noted the comparison with Jesus himself and the ways in which he was, so gentle, so kind with so many people, but where there were positions of power that were abused, where there were leaders who were leading the people falsely, wrongly, where they were taking advantage of them, that Jesus called them out, most famously in Matthew 23, in the most scathing of terms. And he did this for a purpose. He did this with an anger that was directed, that was purposeful, that was to people in power who had corrupted that, who had behaved poorly, who had affected others in their behaviour, to the detriment ultimately of people's souls and the ways in which they responded to God and worshipped God. And so he rightly, likewise, drew attention to this. And so we can learn from this. In the past week, I was listening to a podcast about the painting that's referred to as Guernica. Guernica is also a small market town in Spain. And in 1937, this town became very well known. It became well known because of atrocities that were visited upon this town. So a bit of background, I won't go into the whole history of it. It is a fascinating history that I think we would do well to read up about. I find it quite fascinating anyway, and certainly the painting itself I won't display here, but by all means you can view it online. But during the Spanish Civil War, the General Francisco Franco was trying to basically take the country back from Republicans. Okay, so we're currently on Osaka. Okay, yeah. Sorry, so I'm just catching up with the slides here. So as I mentioned, that Naomi Osaka was using her platform to display the anger that she felt at the social injustices being suffered by people who were victims from those in power. And I was pointing out that several generations before that, the city that should be on the screen now, yeah, we're all caught up, excellent, that just as Osaka used her platform and her medium, that of the tennis court and that of the interviews that she has and the press conferences that she's required to give, and indeed the face masks with the victims of police brutality and of the ways in which violence has been visited disproportionately on certain groups of people. And that this has been a constant. This has been a constant throughout history, and that there is ways in which anger is so detrimental, but there are also ways in which we can channel our anger towards these outrageous acts. And so one of the most famous examples from the 20th century was the painting of Guernica. So the picture on the screen is Guernica just after it had been bombed, first aerially and in part by Spanish forces that were waging a civil war, the Spanish army taking the country back from a democratically elected Republican government that was in Spain, and that Franco had enlisted Nazi Germany to help, and Nazi Germany used this occasion to demonstrate their power. So this was before the full outbreak of war in 1939. This was in 1937, and they had been rebuilding their army and their air force in preparation for military expansion. And so Guernica was a Spanish town, but it was not a strategically important town. It was not a town that was a military garrison or anything like that. It was a market town. It was a market town populated mostly by women and by children. And this air force came through and delivered shock and awe and bombed the city heavily. The ruined remnants you can see in that photo there. After this bombing and the terror of that, and this was a new technology, the war from the air. This was every bit as terrifying as nuclear weapons came to be a little bit later. German and Spanish forces came through and effectively machine gunned many others and really laid waste to the town. A truly shameful moment in 20th century that was full of them. There were reports from journalists pretty soon afterwards that made their way out into the wider world, and they made their way to the Spanish painter Pablo Picasso. And I'm not endorsing lots of Picasso's painting, and I'm not in any way an art historian, but he read of these reports and of the righteous outrage at such atrocities. And so he was commissioned to contribute for the Spanish government in exile at the time, a painting to a French expo that had different pavilions from different countries. And so Picasso in 7 weeks painted a huge painting. It's on a very large canvas, and he painted it in black and white. And it's a painting full of fractured images, full of horrified scenes. Again, I won't go into the full description, but what it does is it tries to capture the actual horror of war and of terror and of injustice and of wanton destruction upon human life by those in authority, by those at the wrong end of weapons. And he did this, again, I think because he was angry at what had been done to his country and to his people and to this village and to innocent lives. In 1930, later on, during World War II, Picasso had stayed in Paris, and Paris was occupied by Nazi Germany officers, and a Gestapo officer had barged his way into Picasso's apartment, and he pointed at a photo of the mural Guernica, and he asked, "Did you do that?" Asked that to Picasso. And Picasso replied, "No, you did." I just think that's a a most marvelous rejoinder, and it's a focus on where the anger should be. It's not on the depiction, it's not on the protest, it's on the horrors and the ways in which they were executed in the first place. So what do we do about our anger? What do we do about our outrage? We're not watched by millions of people playing tennis. At least I'm not. I suspect the audience currently isn't. I suspect none of us are great artists who are going to command millions of people to come and to see our canvas. And yet we have anger circulating through, and the reason I was behind my pictures there, I thought I'd be all good and could remember the order, but of course, as well as the public figures that demand radio and news columns and the platform of Parliament. Likewise, we have these broadcasts, but also narrowcasts in social media dominated by the likes of Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook, Zuckerberg, whose picture was up before, and the reason that I had him there as well is just to demonstrate that these things come into our lives. I'm sure many folk check Facebook on a daily basis, and in doing so we have scrolling through the thoughts and posts of other people, and a lot of times these things are benign. A lot of times these things are not so benign, and these things are the angered outpourings of what people have with the protection of a screen and the speed of a keyboard, and injecting this stuff into the body politic. And so, again, the question is, what do we do with this? We aren't public figures. We may not, like Jesus, have the courage to go to our local council chambers and cry, woe to you, civic leaders, lawmakers, corrupt hypocrites. I suspect that probably won't go down so well. I certainly don't have such courage. I suspect most of us are just in the day-to-day trenches of life. So what in the day-to-day trenches of our lives do we do about anger and its discontents? Well, I think the first thing that would be most wise to do is don't listen to me. I don't have the answers. When I was younger, that is a few days ago, I yelled at a peg box. That sounds absurd, but it's true. After last Wednesday, extolling the virtues of controlling anger and of doing something else, warning about the outbursts, I was hanging up clothes on the clothesline, and we have a peg box outside, and we have a lid that claps on quite tightly so that rain doesn't come in and sort of make everything, I guess, mildewy and rusty and all the rest. And that lid would not undo. It's a lid. It's supposed to undo. It frustrated me no end. Whichever way I did, and I think my fingertips were sore at the time, but I couldn't open this lid. I just wanted the pegs. I wanted this to be simple. I wanted this to be straightforward. I don't have a very practical mind. I couldn't figure out a way to get a screwdriver or whatever else. Eventually I had to lift the peg box off of its bracket, and I was looking like a fool and twisting it this way and that and trying to undo. And of course eventually it did undo. It undid while it was upside down, and all of the pegs scatter everywhere, and so I'm picking up pegs with grass, and I'm doing all of this when all I wanted was to peg out some washing. And so I literally got angry at the peg box. the things anger does, or just the absurdities of me? I think probably mostly the latter. So don't listen to me, don't look at me as some sort of exemplar, commanding the pulpit, speaking into the screen, trying to present a Bible class doesn't make any of us any more perfect. But having said that, I think you can still listen to me. You can still listen to me partly because what else are you going to do for the next 10 minutes? But also because I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to be better. And I had opportunity to put that into practice. So pegbox is bad me. That's me venting, me yelling, me embarrassing myself in front of my wife and no doubt the neighbours, all of that. At work, I do a similar job to AJ. At work, I'm responsible in part for helping staff present lectures and things, education sessions, both in person and also video conference. And so using computers, using connections, trying to make sure microphones and screens work and share and cameras, and trying to make sure that external audiences can also see and hear and take part, all of this sort of stuff. And it's obviously not straightforward, and getting computers to behave and getting cables to behave, all of this. So we have this system that's quite complicated, and I've just about sorted it all out. But everybody's slightly different, and sometimes it works one week and then the next day you fire it up and you do exactly the same thing and it just won't work. It won't talk. Something just won't register. And so I had this USB port connection that just had worked and worked and worked and just wasn't. And there's 40 people in an education session relying on this thing working. And when it doesn't work, you take on the anxiety of the speaker and the organizer, senior doctors and clinicians in the hospital. And so kind of makes me angry, makes me as angry as the peg box. When you do the same thing, it's just a 1 or a 0, but it doesn't seem to replicate in the same way. And you feel like you're letting people down, and you feel like you're stupid for not getting things to work. And so instead of yelling, instead of going back to the technicians and ranting at them and saying, this is rubbish, why isn't this working? And, venting towards them and making them feel rubbish and less likely to help, I slowed myself down, thought through things, and I went and I read. And I read about USB ports, and I read how to help make USB ports work. I learned things. I deepened my knowledge and widened my context of the thing that was making me angry. And instead of letting anger just fester and stew, or letting it, breaking the cable, or, tossing the laptop aside, or whatever it might be, or again, hurting other people or insulting other people and saying, these people are stupid, they don't know what they're doing. All of those options were available to me. Rather than the peg box, I tried to learn. I tried to do something about it that was productive, constructive, helpful, address the underlying issue that was causing the anger. And I learned a lot about USBs, which are a bit more fascinating than you might take for granted. And I learned how to change things around, and since then it's been working. And a little lesson for me, and maybe, just maybe, it might assuage a little bit of the hypocrisy I feel in teaching about anger when I can be given to anger myself. So to get to the crux of the message, covering Spanish history and US tennis and my failings is all good and well, but the core of the message is that we have to acknowledge that anger is a part of our lives, and we have to do something about it. We have to make a choice. We have to be deliberate about this. We can't just assume. We can't just let it be. We can't, again, be like Novak Djokovic and say, well, this is who I am. Because who he is hurt a Lions person. Who he is will continue to hurt other people if he does not take it seriously, if he does not address what he's on about. Everybody that uses anger and outrage as an easy out hurts other people. And they may not see them. If you're on the other side of a keyboard, if you're up in a plane dropping bombs, you don't see who you hurt. You don't see all of the ways in which that filters out. How many tennis players in junior ranks looked at Novak Djokovic and said, there's the number one player in the world. There's the best player. I can behave like that. I can yell and rant at people giving up their time to be an umpire, be a referee, be a coach. I heard that the Penrith Panthers and the rugby league, like the Western Sydney Rugby League junior competitions, they now hire security guards to be at the grounds of a Saturday morning to help police the behaviour of parents. Parents who are angry and who swear and carry on to the point of physical violence. Junior games to junior referees being paid a pittance or nothing at all to help with an entertainment. We have to acknowledge that anger is a part of our lives. We have to do something about it. William Blake, the great English romantic poet, he wrote, I was angry with my friend, I told my wrath did end. I was angry with my foe, I told it not, my wrath did grow. We have to make choices about anger. We can make some pretty basic choices. We can make a basic choice like get some sleep. Tired people are angry people. Tired people are grumpy people. Fatigue makes decision making much more difficult. Fatigue makes emotion control much more difficult. Again, I say this from a point of hypocrisy. I don't get enough sleep. I get tired, and when I get tired, I know, I can feel myself. My ability to get anger shortens and quickens. My fuse shortens. I know that I make poorer decisions, that I get more tunneled vision. If we're feeling that way, we need to sacrifice some things. We need to make sure that if we are in a constant state of fatigue and pretend that it's okay, pretend that we can just manage, pretend that everything is so important that we can't leave it, not only for our own health, but again, this impacts on relationships, this impacts on other people. Sleep is important. And if you're constantly tired and constantly grumpy and constantly snapping at other people and constantly roiling and raging against things and in the car and in the workplace and at children and all of these sorts of things, look at the simple things first. Oftentimes, according to Occam's razor, it's the simplest things that are often the truest. So get some sleep. Don't mess with your brain. Leave your brain alone. Substances that cross into the nervous system, that cross into the brain as the seat of emotion control, the seat of decision making, the seat of thought, both rational and irrational. It's what fatigue affects. It's what substances affect. What's more likely? The newspaper heading that says, an entirely sober person at 2 o'clock in the afternoon punched somebody and started a brawl that led to him being jailed and the person fighting for their life. Or, after a night of heavy drinking, early in the morning, a man punched another, starting a brawl. That man now is in jail for a long time, the other fighting for his life in intensive care. Drinking, drugs affect the brain. They do. Whatever arguments are made for and against all of that stuff, drinking, drugs, the things that people choose to inject in all sorts of ways are designed to alter the brain. They give a sense of euphoria, they give a sense of social license, all of these things. They do that by affecting the brain. But also, the effects are detrimental. Also, the effects, and again, you know this, we know this, but those who affect their brain through the deliberate ingestion of substances will result in anger, will result in an inability to control behavior. And an inability to control behavior leads to adverse consequences, leads to all the damage that is wrought in families, in homes, in societies. So get some sleep, leave your brain alone. The third and the most important point, look at what the Bible says. That ancient text that is so often ignored is about life, and it speaks truly. And it speaks truly about anger. It speaks truly about outrage. Last week we looked at a number of verses that warned us about anger, that painted it in its very real, very true sense, that it can be a problem, and that it most likely is a problem, and that it needs to be taken seriously. We need to warn ourselves about it, and we need to address it. The Bible is likewise equally clear, not just about depicting the problem, but about providing, if not the solution, a framework to address it, providing the principles by which we can live our lives, providing the choices. It gives a clear distinction, a clear delineation. So we should have verses on the screen. AJ, have we got verses on the screen now? So we've got a number of verses on the screen. Yep. And unsurprisingly, several of them are drawn from Proverbs and drawn from the wisdom literature, the literature of life and how to live it. Proverbs 14:29 says, "He who is slow to anger has great understanding." Proverbs 15 and verse 1 says, "A gentle answer turns away wrath." Proverbs 15:18 says, "The slow to anger pacifies contention." And Proverbs 16:32 says, "He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who captures a city." Again, not just one, but verse after verse, the proverbial writer is observing these things and responding to them and showing that if we have the ability to exercise self-control, if we have the ability to slow everything down, to think clearly, decisively, to not indulge, to not let our anger run away and control our behavior, that is much the better outcomes. Likewise, James chapter 1, we looked at verse 20 last week. James 1 verse 19 says exactly the same thing. Let everyone, it says, be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. It's the very opposite of what you want to do when you're angry, isn't it? When you're angry, you can feel your speech quickening. You can feel that you want to get in first. You want to get in next. You want to rail, and that's why Facebook and Twitter are so dangerous, because you can just let the keyboard run. That's why in arguments escalate. That's why people shout over the top of each other. It's quickening everything. The Bible is telling us, slow it down, listen, go read about USBs, figure out the context, understand all the nuance, all the grey areas. Don't just run to where the outrage is and sit there. Ephesians 4, I think, is the most clear, both about what to do and what to replace with anger. Ephesians 4:26. Be angry, do not sin. So don't let your anger rush into all of those behaviors that they're harming others and affecting relationships and damaging reputations. He says, do not let the sun go down on your anger. That's what William Blake said. Address it. Calm things down. Go to the person or go to the situation. Look at the underlying factors. Don't just assume it's the other person's responsibility or the other person's fault, or that we're right all the time, or even if we're right, that the other person is okay with everything. These things are just a few words on a page, but how different the world would be if people just lived by these principles. If I did, if I slowed myself down, if I made sure that the sun did not set on the day where I was angry and upset with another person, or that through my anger I had harmed or spoken poorly or gossiped about or damaged in some way another person. This verse 26 of Ephesians 4, it's part of a series of verses about laying aside the old self, putting on a new self, renewing the spirit of your mind. It's included with verses about speaking the truth with your neighbour, about stealing no more, about not letting any unwholesome word come out of our mouths. This is the company that controlling anger keeps. I think we do well to continually revisit these verses, to check ourselves against them, to hold ourselves accountable against them. Ephesians 4 and verses 31 and 32, he says, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamour and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. He's utterly clear here, utterly demonstrative. Take it and put it aside. It will not be beneficial to your Christian life. It should not be part of this new self that you've put on, and you've put away all of the darkness, all of those things associated with an old and a sinful self. He also says, don't just leave it as a vacuum. Replace it. Fill it. He says, be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving each other, just as God in Christ has also forgiven you. He says here, don't just walk the edge. Don't do these things begrudgingly. Don't think, well, all right, I'll not be angry, but, that's as far as I'm going. No. He says, go to the other extreme. If you're not letting the sun go down on your anger, go to that person and forgive them. Let it go. Repair it. Show kindness to that person, not words of anger and outrage and bitterness and demeaning and argumentative and belittling. I'm not sure where forgiveness kind of got lost along the way somehow, and it's kind of treated with great suspicion these days. And forgiveness is sort of something that is to be kept and only used in the most exceptional of circumstances. Tender-heartedness, thinking the very best of people, wanting the very best for people, looking at people with empathy rather than suspicion, looking at them as someone to be loved, someone to be uplifted, someone to be treated better than myself, someone who is in equal standing, a child of God. That's what these verses mean. That's what these verses call me to do and to behave like, and to serve as a counterpoint to the anger and outrage that is so easy. At the end of the day, what we're being called is to exercise self-control. Anger is a selfish trait. We need to counter it with self-control. And it's not, again, this isn't me saying you need to be in self-control. You need to forgive me. You need to treat me better. I can't do that. All I can do is look at my life, hold the mirror up, and to be in self-control myself, to show kindness myself, to offer forgiveness myself, to slow myself down. And so in order to do that, again, I need to be aware that it's a problem. I need to choose to do these things. And I need to find ways of managing that. Ways like being aware of our body language. If anger escalates things and quickens things, it does that physiologically. We have hormones and things like adrenaline. Adrenaline is useful sometimes. Adrenaline gets you up, gets you going, and allows you to escape something that's chasing you, or allows you to have this short burst of intensity. But it's often destructive. Adrenaline was the thing that coursed through Djokovic when he lost that game. What did he do? No self-control, whacks the ball, hurts somebody. We need to be aware when anger settles in of our voice. We need to be aware of our hands. We need to be aware of our thinking. It's how we'll see anger coming through. Our hands will literally tremble. Our voice will rise in pitch and tone. And from that too, our thinking will start be thinking about all the ways in which we've been wronged, all the ways in which we've been hurt, and dredging those things up and pouring them into the argument and shoveling onto the bonfire to worse and worsen and worsen. Anger, at its core, is a function of communication. All of the violence and things, they start with communication. So don't just think about what you want to say. Think about how your message will be received. Move from the selfish side of things to the others-centered side of things. You may have every rage brain isn't wanting you to look at things so nuanced. It wants simplistically, and it wants to put the focus on the other person as an outlet, as a vent. But what that person's going to do is going to see your anger and they'll match it and raise it, or they'll be cowed by it and hurt by it. If people aren't listening to you, yelling louder is seldom the solution. The truth is, I don't always have to get in the next word. I don't always have to get in the last word. I don't always have to dredge up the past. I don't always have to remind an opponent of every fault. Where there is hurt, we need to acknowledge it and we need to heal it. There is no weakness in forgiveness. It's a sign of strength. It's a sign of humility. It's a sign of the Christian characteristics that should be at the core of who we are and what we do and who we're trying to become. If I'm to not let the sun go down on my anger, and it seems pretty clear that that is what I'm to do, then I'm going to have to swallow my pride. I'm going to have to learn to say sorry. I'm going to have to learn to mend breaks. Djokovic did that to a degree. He went and he saw the lady that he had hurt, but it seems like he's still not fully ready and willing to embrace the core of what led to his damaging acts. Anger is an opportunity to appeal to the better parts of ourselves. Or it's a threat to indulge in the basest parts of ourselves. We have a choice. The Bible makes it clear. In no uncertain terms it tells us, be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamour and slander be put away, along with all malice. And do the counter. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving each other, because we have an example, because we are the beneficiaries, not of God's rage, but of His forgiveness. We need to be kind and tender-hearted and forgiving, because God in Christ has also forgiven us. Thanks very much. We'll leave some discussion questions to ponder. Thank you.